The Spanish Civil War 1936 to 1939 has often been called the dress rehearsal for World War II, and yet this consequential and utterly fascinating conflict is something many of us have never even heard of. Absurd. For Spanish people, it was a conflict of ideological extremes, monarchists, nationalists, and fascists supplied by Hitler and Mussolini, who rose up against the Second Spanish Republic, a coalition of socialists, communists, and anarchists, supported by Stalin's Soviet Union. Thousands of Americans volunteered in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The British author George Orwell joined the fight. Even J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis had opinions about it. I've covered Spain's Civil War for years. I even filmed a mini-doc in Madrid years ago, and I'm convinced more people would be obsessed with it too if they just had someone to advocate for it passionately. I want to infect you with the same passion that I have, showing why it's relevant for everyone, everywhere, right now. Starting with fascists versus communists. You can begin to understand the war's modern relevance with a look at the outrageous political polarization of the time. The 1936 Spanish general election must have been the craziest in all of history. I'm serious. If you cast your ballot in 1936, you had the actual choice of voting for a party inspired by German and Italian fascism. Floating head fascism not your cup of tea? How about the Communist Party? You like the extremism but not the authoritarianism? No problem. Cast your ballot for the independent anarchists. Spanish voters must have felt whiplash going down their ballots. Now, I don't want to overstate the case, there were centrists in the mix too, but the extremes in 1936 carried significant political power and influence in Spain, and the election would lead these poles of ideology to civil war within months. So why was Spain so divided by 1936? Well, centuries of decline and hardship for ordinary people produced two things: different answers about how to revive Spain to its so-called golden age, and various political powers fighting to implement their solution. Spain had gone from running the largest empire since ancient times in 1600 to losing almost everything by 1900. A few of their last major colonies, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, were handed over to the United States after the Spanish-American War in 1898. Back in Europe, Spain spent the 1800s, like many countries, balancing their monarchy with liberalizing forces. They even briefly became a republic in 1873. When that experiment was ended, the 1876 Constitution created a constitutional monarchy under Alfonso XII. But ideologies were simmering. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 inspired Spanish Marxists and terrified conservatives who saw their Catholic monarchy under threat. These fears caused King Alfonso XIII to turn a blind eye when General Primo de Rivera staged a coup in 1923. Rivera's dictatorship suspended the constitution, but ultimately fell apart during the Great Depression. The king, who had acquiesced to dictatorship in 1923, demanded its end in 1930, but this brought about the king's downfall too. Into the power vacuum came a surge of Republican sentiment. After elections showed large anti-monarchist feeling in 1931, Alfonso XIII went into exile. The Second Spanish Republic was born, young and vulnerable. That vulnerability was made worse by anger. A government of the new republic managed to upset just about everyone. Prime Minister Manuel Azaña's coalition from 1931 to 1933 slashed the size of the military, initiated land redistribution, supported women's rights, and reduced the power of the Catholic Church. Article 3 of the new constitution even declared the Spanish state has no official religion. The political right was furious. Wishing for King Alfonso XIII to return from exile and reclaim the throne, Lieutenant General José Sanjurjo led a failed military coup d'etat in August 1932. But the political right weren't the only ones angry. To many on the left, Azaña wasn't radical enough. Sure, he reduced church power, but did he actually burn churches down to the ground like some anarchists? No. He initiated land reform, but did he support the full collectivization like his socialist colleagues? No. To the left of Azaña were many who thought he didn't go far enough in tearing down Spain's power structures. Prime Minister Azaña barely scraped by for a couple of years before more elections were held in 1933. In these, many anarchists abstained, and the pendulum swung the other way. A right-wing coalition won and took power, and they reversed most of what Azaña's government had done. So you start to see the back and forth. This caused an intense reaction on the left, which reorganized itself and initiated strikes. Most notable was an anarchist-led miners' uprising in Asturias that was put down by the military. At least 1,500 died, and tens of thousands were imprisoned. This was the insanity of Spanish politics before the Civil War. While elections were still happening and power transferred somewhat peacefully between left and right, political violence was all over the place. Churches burned, priests were murdered, right-wing officers staged coup, a left-wing uprising ended in massacre. The stage was set for something larger and darker. I think you can now imagine the disparities of the 1936 election, the last before everything changed. To increase their odds of taking power, most parties of the left and most parties of the right joined in two different large coalitions. All the parties within those coalitions would cooperate if victorious. On the right, you had the National Front. Its largest member was CEDA, Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas. Its leader, Gil Robles, inspired by Mussolini and Hitler, also emulated their campaign materials. The core of CEDA and the Spanish right was conservative Catholicism. Generally, this also meant a restoration of the Spanish monarchy. And there were two kinds of monarchists in Spanish politics, the Alfonsists and the Carlists. I actually had to have a call with a friendly historian to help me distinguish them. Alfonsists, as the name implies, wanted Alfonso XIII to retake the throne, but beyond that, their politics were more moderate, more classically liberal. Carlists, on the other hand, were monarchists too, but wanted a different king. Now, it's not worth diving into who. More important is that the Carlists were more active conservatives. Anthony Beaver called them arch-conservatives. As my new historian friend put it, they were the keep Spain great folks. King, church, a dash of populism, though usually not too radical. But speaking of radicalism, the Phalangists, Falange Española, the Spanish phalanx. The Phalangists were the most explicitly fascist group in the 1936 elections. Their leader was Primo de Rivera. If that name sounds familiar, it's because this was the son of the dictator we spoke of earlier. The Falange party didn't actually do that well in the 1936 elections, but it's still worth mentioning because of who would go on to join its ranks. General Francisco Franco. He's important, and we'll mention him again very soon. So on the right, you had nationalists, explicit fascists, footsie fascists, monarchists, both Alfonsists and Carlists, conservative Catholics, industrialists, and landowners. The blending of these into political parties made up the National Front. And on the left, you had the Popular Front, Frente Popular. The name of this coalition itself, Popular Front, was derived at an international communist conference, the 7th Conference of the Comintern. And so, yes, as you would expect, the Spanish Communist Party was within the Popular Front. Standard parties of the left were there too. For example, the Socialists, left-wing Republicans, and a trade union workers' party. Catalan nationalists were also under the Popular Front umbrella. There were other flavors of Marxists present, like the National Confederation of Labor, CNT, the largest force of anarchists in Spain, and the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, POM, which we'll return to when we speak about George Orwell. So on the left, you had secular socialists, communists, anarchists, regional nationalists, and left Republicans. The blending of these made up the Popular Front. In February 1936, the National Front, the right-wing coalition, was successful in these areas. Winning along the outside of the map and in the dead center around Madrid was the Popular Front. Official results gave the win to the Popular Front, but it was a contested and narrow victory. So, 2 governments ago, we had a left-wing government that changed everything. And then, 1933, we get a right-wing government that cancels everything. Now it's 1936, we get another left-wing government that's going to change it all back again. It's just so wobbly, and now it's going to fall over into war. As the leftists of the Popular Front began planning their time in political office, officers in the military were already planning their next coup. On July 17, 1936, General Francisco Franco, remember him, and his experienced Army of Africa began an uprising in Morocco. The next day, garrisons across Spain made decisions about whether to rebel or remain loyal. Meanwhile, the government began distributing weapons to trade unions and independent militias, ready to defend the Republic. The Spanish Civil War was underway. As the commander of the Spanish Foreign Legion put it, "Viva la muerte," long live death. And now I did just quote a military person, but don't worry, I'm not about to put little toy soldiers on a battle map and give a play-by-play of the war. We will resist the pull of the military history industrial complex. But now that we know why the prelude to the Spanish Civil War is interesting, what about the war itself? The Spanish Civil War is known to this day as the staging ground for World War II, the dress rehearsal for the most devastating war in all human history. That's because the war did not remain a domestic affair. Several foreign powers intervened in Spain, hoping to bring their preferred side to power and to give their armed forces practice for a future global conflict. One of those powers was Nazi Germany. Initial German supplies for Franco's nationalists were ferried into Spain through Salazar's Portugal, but this support became far more direct when Adolf Hitler accepted a personal letter from Francisco Franco and came to the decision, above his advisors and bureaucracy, to intervene with manpower, planes, and other materiel. Not only did Mr. Hitler send planes and tanks for Franco to use, he sent some of his own air force, Luftwaffe, to gain experience in Spain. They were called the Condor Legion, and in just a second we'll see how their acts of terror are not forgotten in Spain, even today. While Germany's Condor Legion bombings were devastating, those made by Franco's Italian allies were larger in volume and more decisive. Bombing raids in Barcelona would help bring about its fall to nationalists in early 1939, a clear sign of the end of the war. But even from the start of the war, Italy's leader Benito Mussolini was enthusiastic to support Franco and the nationalists. Just 2 weeks into Franco's uprising against the Republic in 1936, Italian assistance was on its way through the Mediterranean. In total, about $500 million of fascist financial support went to Franco, along with 100,000 German and Italian soldiers to serve along nationalist forces. The Republic received outside intervention too, though less than the international sympathy for them would suggest. While the Republican government was seen as a legitimate government by Western democracies, Britain and France had policies of non-intervention, as did other European countries and the United States. These attempts at neutrality or non-intervention were not watertight, but they did serve to weaken the Republic's position, while their nationalist rivals got help from fascist Germany and Italy loud and proud. Unlike the nationalists, who got 100,000 trained soldiers from Germany and Italy, the Republic had nothing on this scale. So in order to match the volume of the nationalists, the Republicans relied on foreign volunteers, just people who decided to show up and help without permission of their home governments. I've seen numbers totaling somewhere between 50 and 60,000 internationals who made their way to Spain through unofficial channels to serve in militias and specific foreign brigades. The international brigades came from Russia, France, the UK, the US, Canada, even Germany and Italy. The list goes on and on. The anti-fascists who joined the international brigades played a major role in the war. For example, about 2,000 of them participated in the Battle for Madrid in 1936, which prevented its fall to Franco until the end of the war. So assured was the Republican government that Madrid would fall in 1936 that they had relocated the capital to Valencia. So convinced were nationalists that Madrid would fall that nationalist radio announced that General Franco had already made it to the center of the city on a white horse. But the international brigades, along with civilians and anarchist militias, held Madrid's line through the end of 1936. This forced Francisco Franco to switch strategy. Instead of a quick invasion, he had to siege Madrid for 2 years. This was a massive setback that delayed complete victory and a massive psychological victory for the Republic. It would not have happened without international volunteers. Back to nation states, one of the often forgotten supporters of the Republic was Mexico, which sent rifles and ammunition. As Spain's agricultural output collapsed, Mexico supplied food, but by far the largest support for the Spanish Republic came through the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was slow to aid the Republic, beginning only with fuel exports. Military supplies began trickling in the fall, but rival deliveries from fascist governments had already been arriving for months at that point. The Soviets officially had 2,000 soldiers on the ground, more clandestinely. Soviet and Comintern support for the Republic totaled in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In turn, though smaller in number, Spanish communists came to the forefront of the defense of the Republic, as reliance on Stalin deepened. But Soviet support dwindled as the situation worsened for the Republic. As the Spanish National Bank's reserve of gold and silver ran low, the Soviets became more stingy, even with basic loans. So if it's not already obvious, I'll spell it out. The dress rehearsal aspect of the Spanish Civil War is reflected through the actions of the international community in Spain. While countries like Germany and Italy aggressively pursued another fascist state in Europe, Britain and France were hoping they could ignore the whole thing until it just went away. The USA practiced isolation, though firms sold equipment and oil. The Soviets started the war riding the fence, being as minimal in their support for the Republic as they could be without losing face, only to have their hands forced by developments. Now, I'm not one for basic boy military history, but that sounds fairly on brand for all those countries. Stage setting for something truly awful on the horizon. As British author George Orwell wrote, his fellow Englishmen were all sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, from which I sometimes fear that we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs. His prediction came true in the London Blitz. So we've looked at the big picture through ideology and foreign powers, but in my opinion, you can't truly develop a passion for learning about the Spanish Civil War until you zoom in and find someone that interests you. And for me, that person is George Orwell. Orwell is best known for his works Animal Farm in 1984. While Orwellian has become a catch-all for political rhetoric we find distasteful and Big Brother a misunderstood symbol to sell Apple computers in the 1980s, Orwell's real politics are subtle and independent, and his tragic time in Spain would help develop his worldview into something that would influence discourse through today. George Orwell chose to live out his values fighting fascism during Spain's Civil War. And with fight fascism, I don't mean show up and protest. I don't mean lollygag in Madrid while publishing Spanish Republican propaganda, looking at you, Ernest Hemingway. I mean literally fighting fascism in a militia, which Orwell joined upon arrival in Barcelona. His story of doing so is brilliantly and excessively detailed in his book, Homage to Catalonia. Towards the beginning of the book is Orwell's most straightforward description of his motivation for going to Spain and fighting for the survival of its republic. He writes, "For years past, the so-called democratic countries had been surrendering to fascism at every step. Orwell took the precarious trip through France and over the border into Catalonia with a vague sense that it was time to take a stand as an anti-fascist. Britain, his liberal democracy, wasn't acting, so he would." Upon arrival in 1936, Orwell was enchanted with the classless vibe in Barcelona, which was dominated at the time by anarchists. So he joined the ranks of an independent anarchist militia. We mentioned them earlier, the POM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. While the Spanish Republic was leaning further and further to Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, Orwell joined a militia that was explicitly anti-Stalinist. But Orwell became disillusioned as time dragged on. The POM's training was terrible, the military structure was anarchist like its party, so officers could question the orders of those above them at any time. I don't really know if this fits into the disillusionment category, but Orwell got shot in the neck. And this is when it all unraveled for George Orwell. As he recovered from his wound back in Barcelona, Republican infighting took hold. In 1937, communist influence in the Republican government was at its peak, and reorganization was taking place to bring independent militias to heel and to purge those not in conformity with Stalin's influence. Orwell's POM and other anarchists found themselves under fire in the streets of Barcelona as they resisted integration, and soon after, Orwell fled the country. So Orwell arrived with optimism and left under fire from Republican allies. This experience gave Orwell a clearer vision of his politics. He later wrote, "Every serious line of work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." Now, totalitarianism to Orwell obviously includes nationalists and fascists. That's why he came to Spain and fought, but his perception of totalitarianism is also a critique of communism under Joseph Stalin. Knowing this, we can read Animal Farm in 1984 with greater understanding. This is, as Christopher Hitchens titled his book, Why Orwell Matters. Orwell wasn't the only writer to take an interest in the Spanish Civil War. We already mentioned the inferior Ernest Hemingway, who wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls, a fictional account of an American volunteer who was tasked with blowing up a bridge in the Sierra de Guadarrama Mountains, northwest of Madrid. J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings trilogy, argued his preference for the nationalists with his friend C.S. Lewis, who disapproved of the uprising. Indeed, while the Spanish Civil War is mostly lost to public imagination today, perhaps rushed over between World War I and II, it was a hot topic of its day. And it wasn't just writers. Artists of many kinds expressed their feelings about the war, including Pablo Picasso, who was inspired by a truly awful event. On April 26, 1937, Hitler's Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica. They fired, rounded, and repeated until 100,000 pounds of bombs were dropped over 3 hours. Accounts are disputed, but somewhere between 100 and 1,000 died. Many civilians were mowed down by strafing planes, others asphyxiated in shelters, deprived of oxygen by the raging fires. The intent was clearly the intimidation of a people, a terror tactic carried out indiscriminately. The New York Times published a contemporary account by correspondent George Steer, which described the demoralization of the civil population and the destruction of the cradle of the Basque race. In Paris, Pablo Picasso decided to paint. "In the panel on which I am working," he said, "which I shall call Guernica, I clearly express my abhorrence of the military caste, which has sunk Spain in an ocean of pain and death." This is what he produced, a colossal canvas which stretched 25 feet wide and over 11 feet high. When I was a teaching assistant in Spain, I had the privilege of taking several of my 4th grade classes to the Reina Sofia Museum to see it. The black, white, and gray give glossless life to horrific imagery. Fearing Nazi invasion of France, Picasso sent Guernica to the United States Museum of Modern Art in New York. The painting, he demanded, was not to reside in Spain until democracy was restored. The move was prudent because Paris was occupied by the Germans in June 1940. A Gestapo officer rummaging through Picasso's studio came across a photo of Guernica's creation process. "Did you do this?" the officer asked. Picasso's reply is perhaps apocryphal. "No. You did." I sometimes wonder if our visits to see Guernica at the Reina Sofia Museum had an impact on those students, because at this point they're old enough to take part in the cultural battles around the Spanish Civil War and Francisco Franco that continue in Spain today. And that's because the Spanish Civil War had a long impact. After winning the war, Franco was Spain's dictator until dying peacefully in his sleep in 1975. When I was living in Madrid, I spoke with a couple older Spaniards who said things like, well, at least things were orderly under the dictatorship. When I filmed my mini-doc there, I recorded bullet holes at the University City in Madrid, still unrepaired from the battle there. And I regret doing this last thing, but I did pay a visit to the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, during my time in Spain. It's a sanctuary built on the side of the Sierra de Guadarrama mountain range, the same one Hemingway wrote about in For Whom the Bell Tolls. The remains of at least 30,000 Civil War victims are buried there. And at the time I visited, so was the late General Franco, whose corpse mingled with nationalist and Republican fallen alike. As you might expect, this place is absurdly controversial. Franco was exhumed there in 2019 after a protracted legal battle. In 2020, there was an effort by the socialist government to secularize the site through a democratic memory law. Speaking of democracy, Spain did democratize after Franco's death, but a desire for Franco's politics never went away. In 1981, an attempted coup d'etat in the Spanish Congress tried to stop democratization in its infancy. Today, as European politics lurches to the right, new Spanish political parties like Vox are reopening historical debates about the nature of the Civil War and Franco's regime. But I told you the Spanish Civil War wasn't only relevant for Spaniards. I live in Washington, D.C., so I'm here on the campus of Howard University. Among other aspects of its pretty long history, Kamala Harris gave her concession speech here a couple weeks ago. It was also the place where pre-med student Thaddeus Battle, and yes, as far as I can tell, that is his real name, decided to leave this side of the Atlantic in 1936 and head to Spain. He fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, was injured, but was able to return home safe and sound. Now, I don't know the full motivation of Thaddeus, so I won't use his story as a prop, but he wasn't the only American to decide that it was the right moment to take a stand. There was a feeling that history swung on a hinge. To control the future, one had to push or pull. Doesn't it feel that way now? I don't mean a cheap point about the back and forth of elections. I produced a digital event a couple years ago with Adam Tooze. He used the term polycrisis. Basic sense is multiple challenges for humanity all at once. War, climate, threats to democracy. If you're like me, it's really easy to feel lost in it. The more I learn about the Spanish Civil War, the more it turns out to be the opposite of what it appears. At a glance, it seems to be the clash of great and confident ideologies, the masses divided with the conviction to fight. And obviously there was conviction, otherwise so many would not have gone on to fight. But what I also see now when I look closer is lost people just grabbing on. Now, I can't psychoanalyze historical figures of the past, but just look at George Orwell, who told us at the beginning of his time in Spain, he really just wanted to be there to take a stand. Another person who comes straight to mind is this woman who was photographed on top of a hotel in Barcelona, Marina Ginesta. She's got a rifle on her back for the communists. She's also, in the image, just 17 years old. While she looks bright and idealistic, could she really know the consequences of Stalinism? And I look at young men today. When I first started making videos about the Spanish Civil War years ago, the battles over historical memory were mostly confined to places like the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, or confined to Spain itself. Sure, there were historical and cultural debates about whether Franco technically fit the definition of a fascist, though his supporters in contemporary footage seem to have no doubt. The landscape has changed since I first uploaded. Some on the right are once again honoring those who masquerade as simple and pious traditionalists. Now, some on the American right are calling for a Protestant Franco. They've lifted the caudillo out of old history books. Separately, there's a new generation of American Catholic nationalists that are uploading videos, glossy and a little clumsy, romanticizing Francisco Franco's dictatorship. But I think this goes beyond simple left and right narratives. Spain was divided then, we're divided now. Political violence was becoming normalized then, political violence is becoming normalized now. Did we have religion or tradition in government or secular policy? I think that's all a little too obvious. The true parallel is the lack of direction and meaning, especially for men, the sense of being lost with nothing to grab onto. Seeing it up close today, it strikes me that the romanticization of the far right of yesteryear, or the predators or nonsense esoterics of today, it comes from a place of despair. Old ways of finding meaning dissolve, so obscure corners of the internet, or to my genuine surprise, obscure Spanish fascism, give a sense of identity and order. Something coded for your insecurity is better than nothing. It's not material. It's emotional. And so that sense that Thaddeus Battle perhaps felt is back with us here now. That sense that History swings on a hinge. The door isn't closing. We can't avoid what's on the other side. We need to walk through with our values clear. It's not just as simple as democracy good, fascism bad, though that's undoubtedly true. The future we are building needs to have meaning, not just opposition. That's the lesson of the Spanish Civil War I see for us today. For a full prescription, I've uploaded a meditation on citizenship and a list of books to read if you're interested in the Spanish Civil War to my Substack. Please go and join what I'm trying to make a productive conversation. Heads held high, happy warriors. Later, y'all.